folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And this is part number 2 of fixing the suspension of the Mini. In part number 1 I showed you on how to take the upright off the vehicle, and we actually changed the bearings inside the upright. But in part number 2, which is this part, we're going to fix the ball joints. The wheel hub is connected to the upright and held together with the drive shaft, but the upright is connected to the suspension. And that's done through what we call ball joints. And ball joints is nothing more than pivoting points. So it's very important that those ball joints are in a good condition, that they don't have too much play. And a quick test to find out if your ball joints are still in a good shape is actually to jack up the car, take the wheel in the top and the bottom and try to jiggle it back and forth. So like this. If you feel play, then the ball joints had their best time. Now I know this is a rear wheel, so you can't do it on this one, but just as an example. I have the upright on a stand, and on this side you see the lower ball joint, and on the right hand side you see the upper ball joint. Now this one, the bottom one, is still in a fairly good shape. You can see you can move this around. It's a bit tough, but that's how it should be. It should not be falling down in the middle position like this one on this side. Look at that. It just drops down. So this ball joint is really worn out, and I'm not kidding, this ball joint is really worn out. Alright, so what do you need to do with this? Well, first of all, you can actually replace these, and those are very cheap. And replacing the ball joints isn't very difficult, be it in the car or out of the car. It's always good to buy good quality ball joints, and I went for heavy duty ball joints because again they cost a little bit more, but still they are very cheap, and it's not worthwhile to keep driving the vehicle with bad ball joints because you're going to have wear and tear on your tires, and at the end the tires are going to cost you much more than actually replacing a ball joint. So what we're going to do now is actually to look at a ball joint, how it's been fit together. We'll disassemble it and then we'll install a new one. And there are some very specific things you need to consider when you're going to install a ball joint, because you will have to check the play of that. And for that play, you got adjustment, you got a whole bunch of little spacers or washers of different thickness. So there's different methods of doing this. I have my method. Some people use another method, but that's all right. We'll see how we do it. So let's start with taking the top ball joint apart. So I have actually cheated a little bit already. So I knocked off the locking plate. So typically these edges are bent over to hold this big nut in place. So first of all, knock that over. Then take a big socket, slide it over, and undo this big nut here, or this big cap. Let me hold this. And that typically goes off very easily. Try to use an impact wrench. Now inside you will find this little pivoting point that's sitting right there. And then you have actually the ball joint itself fitted like this. So that's how it can actually rotate inside. So you're going to start having wear and tear on this surface, but also on the little point inside. Now on the top one there is no spring. In the bottom one there is an additional spring on that one. And then you can start taking off all the old spacers. Right? There's a whole bunch of them on here. Now in some cases it might just be sufficient to remove some of those and mount the ball joint back together to have it working again. In my case, I'm not going to do this. I probably could have done it because look how many spacers I have on this. But I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to install new ones. Now, before you can take off the locking plate, there is a greasing nipple here all the way on the bottom, and that you need to undo first, and then you can slide that off. Once you have all this removed, and this is pretty easy stuff, guys, clean it very well, and I already have cleaned it. And now we can start looking on how we're going to fit a new kit onto that. So a new ball joint has a lot of little parts, and they all fit together very simple like this. And then this part goes inside, and then you have a gaiter that goes on top of it. On the old one that was gone, that was no longer on it. And then you have the bolt that secures it down to the suspension system itself. Let's do a little dry run on how we're going to put this together. First of all, we have this little pivoting point that goes in there. And there's a hole in the middle, that's for the grease to come through from the greasing nipple. Then we'll have to install finally the locking ring, making sure that we can fit the greasing nipple right there. We will have to put some spacers up. I don't know yet how many. This is something we'll have to measure, but let me just get the few on. And then we will install actually the bolt, and we will tighten down the nut to about 105 Newton meters. That's about the torque you need to put it. Right? And then we'll put the cover up, and then of course then we can install it onto the vehicle and we are all set. We should not forget to knock this panel over here. That's the last thing we need to do. Alright, so all this is pretty easy to install. So now we need to figure out what is the size of the spacer we need to put in between. But remember, this should be able to move freely, but it shouldn't fall down. Now this is way too loose, so if I tighten it down a bit, it's still way too loose. I think you can see it even now with the spacers. You know, it's going to be tough. Now some people tighten it down with spacers in between, what they more or less guess, and then they check it, and then they open it up again, and then they reduce or increase the spacers. You know, work like that, and they do it a couple of times. I'm going to do this differently. So let me remove all this again, because we don't need to do that, and show you on how we're going to measure actually the spacer, or determine the size of the spacer. So now let's determine the size of the spacers, and first of all we put the pivoting point in. Now remember, right now don't put any grease up anywhere, no grease. Next we're going to install the big nut, and notice that I don't have the locking plate in place. Over here nothing, it's just the bare upright. I'm just going to take this apart, let me stick it up, and we lock it down. Now I'm going to lock this until the bolt is no longer having any play up or down, and I can still move it around freely. So if I tie it too far, this is too tight, you see, I can't barely move it. This would be too loose, because I can still move it up and down. So I'm going to tighten this to a point whereby I don't have any more lateral play, and I can still move it around. So I think this is about it. This is about it. Right. And now it's important to measure the gap between the nut and the upright. And to measure that gap, I'm going to use a feeler gauge, and I'm going to start probably with 1 millimeter, because that's how it looks like. So I'm going to put my gauge in there. That's 1 millimeter. So I think I'm going to go to 1.5. So basically what I'm going to do is take two plates together. So 1.5. So now I have two. Now I have two of them. I will put them together, make sure there's no debris in between them, and then we'll measure again. And I think this is a bit too tight. No, that's all right. I think this is about right. Yeah. So what I know is that I have now 1.5 millimeters. I now need to deduct 0.9, because that's the size of the locking plate. So that means 0.6 millimeters of spacers. That's what I'm going to need. A little recap. So we installed the ball joint without any grease, without the locking plate, just the nut and the bolt, and of course the pivoting point inside, and we have tightened it down by hand until there is no more lateral play and it can still move around. And then we use the gauge to measure the gap in between the bottom of the nut and the upright. And I measured 1.5 millimeters. And I know that my locking plate is 0.9 millimeters. So I need to deduct from the 1.5, 0.9 millimeters. So that gives me 0.6 millimeters. So now I need to fit a few of these spacers that make up together 0.6 millimeters. And then I should be all set, and then I can tighten it up, and then of course we'll grease it. So let's check out what we have here in terms of spacers, because I don't know what their thickness is. You can measure these spacers the way you like to measure them, but I like to measure them with my micrometer, and I have it set up here. So this is actually a spacer of 0.15 mil. So let's check this out. That's 0.1 mil. And this guy, oh, that's about 0.3 mil. And this guy is 0.2 mil. I'm just going to go around a bit. This is a thin one. This is 0.1, and this is a thicker one again. So I think if I use the two thicker ones, I probably end up with about more or less 0.6. Maybe I need a little bit more. Let's see. Try again. Yeah, I might need a very small extra spacer. Maybe I go for the 0.1 extra. It might be just too much, but let's see how that goes. Yeah, that's a little bit too much, but I think that will probably work. So I'm going to try those three first and see how that goes. So now I'm going to disconnect all this. Let's put this together and see. I'm going to start with the three spacers together, which was a bit more than 0.6, but you never know. Still no grease though. And I'm just going to put it up and tighten it up and see what it does. This is still very loose. So now I need to tighten it up to 105 Newton meters and then check it out. So let me do that. There we go. That's 105 Newton meters. And the pivoting point is still moving properly. You know, it's a bit stiff, but that's how it should be. Now remember, it doesn't have no grease. So this is set. We torqued it down to 105 Newton meters, and you can see that it is quite all right. You know, I can still move it in all the directions. It's a bit stiff. It still has no oil in it or grease, but that's exactly what you want to have it. You want to have it that stiff. It can still move around, but it has to be a bit stiff. Still free, but stiff, no play. So the measurement we did was quite accurate to start with. So this is how I'm doing this. Other people do it in a different way, but that's okay. Let me see if the nipple is tight. And it is. All right, so I'm going to put some grease in and then rotate it a little bit. There we go, and you see it coming out here on the side. Unfortunately, it's on the back side, so let's see if I can move it around. Maybe you can see it coming out on the other side. There you see it coming? That's what I want to see. And I'm going to wipe it off and then just keep moving it around a bit. Let's clean that up. I don't mind if it stays on the top there. I'll put the gator up. And it's ready to go onto the car once we've done the bottom side. Now the bottom side is exactly the same. But I'll show it to you anyway once I get to the spring, because there is a little spring, but the methodology is exactly the same. We still have to knock over the locking ring here, but that's a minor thing to do. The edges here, like so, so it cannot move. I also will do the back side. So I released the bottom ball joint nut, and you could see that somebody already had knocked on it before. Probably they didn't have the right socket for it. That's what people do sometimes. So I'm going to take this apart, and as you can see, there's really not much of a difference between that one and the top one, except that it has a bigger grease nipple and that there is a spring inside. So let me see if I can open that up. And in here, and this is really old grease, as you can see, there is a spring. Let's see, I'm going to use a little magnet. Maybe I can, there we go, get it out. This is the spring I was referring to. That's the only place where you have this. It's not on the top, it's only on the bottom. All right, so now I'm going to remove all the shims just the same way as we did with the other one, and then we do the adjustment exactly the same way. We fit it together without grease, and then we should be able to measure, and then we should be able to determine the right shims. Now these old shims are hard to get off. It's like they're kind of locked in place almost. Now let me continue with this, and then we clean it all up. Less shims on the bottom side here than on the top side. Okay, oh, there's one more. Yeah, tough to get off. So that must be an 11. There we go. Take that off. Now this panel can go off. And now it's a matter of cleaning it all up, because this is really dirty. All this old grease has to go before we do anything else. And I often use brake cleaner for this, but first I'm going to take most of it off. Alright, and now I can use some brake cleaner to spray it clean. So we use our feeler gauge and check. Now this is 1 millimeter. I'm going to give it 0.2 more. So I'm adding a second plate, and I think this is about right. So this is 1.2 millimeter. So I need to put a spacer up of about 0.3 mil. Two of those spacers together makes 0.3 mil. So now I can fit that one, and everything should be all right. So let's see. Alright, so I torqued it and it feels actually quite alright. So both are now good, so now I can grease it, lock it, and we are done with it. Alright, so let's put the grease gun up and grease that baby. There we go, grease is coming out nicely on the sides. Move it around a bit. Okay. That should be good enough. All right. Oh, let me clean up. It's a bit too greasy. I was a bit too generous with my grease. All right. Put the rubber up, or the gator, and this is also ready to be fitted. I still need to knock over the edges here, but that's an easy peasy thingy. So let me do that first. That's one, and I'll also do the other side. So folks, we're nearing the end of this video, and we have installed the new ball joints and adjusted the play on them, and I have given it a bit of fresh paint, so now it's about ready to be reinstalled on the vehicle. We also changed the bearings in part number 1, so now it's a matter of waiting for part number 3, where we're going to assemble everything back together onto the vehicle and install the drive shaft and some CV joints onto the drive shaft. Thank you for viewing, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye bye.